Okay, moving on to some new, oh, you know what? I forgot something important. Can't forget our chill time, right? Gotta have our time to ease in. Let our brain settle back in. Now I can say hi, welcome back. A little bit more endocrine system pathologies. And then we'll do some examples of figuring out what's going on. How do we figure out, with given some information, what the level of the pathology is? Okay, so second sort of group, talking about endocrine pathologies. We're going to focus for right now on this extraordinary gland called, it's a little, kind of looks like a butterfly. You guys may remember from your rat lab which gland kind of looks like a butterfly. It's the thyroid. Thyroid gland. Wicked, wicked, wicked important. It's in the neck here. And I actually have an image to show you rather than trying to draw something this time. Thyroid gland does like so much important stuff. So the thyroid gland, as you know, produces thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones, T3, T4. Often if someone is very, very, very tired, people will have their thyroid hormones checked. Also calcitonin. And these are important to the kidneys and bone, as we saw in the previous lecture. Bone, kidneys. The thyroid gland produces hormones that are critically important to essentially every part of your body. So, talking about calcitonin over here, bone and kidneys. T3, T4 is important in muscle contractions. Again, these are also important in your bone health. Thyroid's pretty important. We got brain development, digestion, heart function, and heart function. Okay, so T3, T4, calcitonin coming from the thyroid, pretty stinking important hormones. Looking at the cascade of what's happening, we're going to start with thyroid releasing hormone and follow this through. Oh, that's a little bit early. I don't know if I can move that. We're going to come back to that. We'll go down here. Okay, so the pathway, an example of the pathway when we're talking about the thyroid, is that there's some stimulus. And what happens is that the hypothalamus then secretes thyroid releasing hormone or thyrotropin releasing hormone. So hypothalamus is going to secrete I think your book uses thyrotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so thyrotropin releasing hormone comes from the hypothalamus. It comes here to the anterior pituitary. In my image, I'm going to keep anterior this way and posterior this way. So, thyrotropin releasing hormone gets released to the bloodstream and goes to the anterior pituitary. This is the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then secretes thyroid stimulating hormone. It's always nice when the names are easy like that, right? So anterior pituitary, again, these are all hormones. That means they all have to be released into the blood. Even when, so the hypothalamus and the pituitary are like right here next to each other, but this is still, it's a hormone. It still has to go through the blood. Then thyroid stimulating hormone. This is a hormone. It has to get released into the blood. Thyroid stimulating hormone gets released into the blood. And then where do you think thyroid stimulating hormone goes? Of course, boom, to the thyroid, right? Goes in the blood. Thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid. Our super, super important endocrine gland that does all sorts of critical things for our body. Okay. Goes in the blood, it goes to the thyroid. Then the thyroid gland secretes T3, T4, and it has to secrete T3, T4. These are hormones. T3 and T4 are hormones, so where do those have to go? Once again, they have to go into the blood. Because, boom, they're hormones. Hormones have to travel in the blood. So we secrete T3, T4. T3 and T4 is then going to go to target cells. Target cells have to have what? They have to have the receptors. They have to have the receptors for T3, T4, and then what happens is, boom, the response to T3 and T4 is increased cellular metabolism. So all that stuff that we talked about in our earlier lectures, we talked about cellular respiration, metabolism, enzyme activity, all of that stuff that produces ATP. T3 and T4 stimulate that increased cellular metabolism. I've lost my mouse. Okay, so let's link in the things that we've been learning in this whole discussion of the endocrine system. So we've learned about T3 and T4 already. T3 and T4, their broad category these are the thyroid hormones. Okay. So thyroid hormones are what class of hormones? We discussed 3 broad classes of hormones. What are thyroid hormones? Okay, thyroid hormones are amino acid derivatives. They are hormones derived from amino acids. And remember that there are 2 sort of groups of these amino acid derived hormones. There's a group that acts like peptide hormones, and there's a group that acts like steroid hormones. Which group are thyroid hormones? Stop and think about that for a second. So thyroid hormones are the ones that act like steroid hormones. And they have, remember, these amino acid derivatives, this group that we're talking about, are derived from tyrosine. So T3 and T4 are the ones that have two tyrosines, whereas the catecholamines only have one. So T3 and T4 have two, and they act like steroids. If they act like steroids, when T3 and T4 have traveled through the blood and they get to their target cells and they increase metabolism, by what method, what are they doing here at the target cell? First question is, where is their receptor? And then when they get to the receptor, what does binding their receptor do? So first question we want to think about is, where is the receptor, pulling on that prior knowledge that we've learned in previous lectures, and then what happens when they bind that receptor? So because these are thyroid hormones, they have the two tyrosines, they act like steroid hormones, the receptor is going to be inside the cell. Remember, steroid hormones are lipophilic. They can pass through the plasma membrane. So our thyroid hormone is going to pass through the plasma membrane, and it's going to bind its receptor inside the cell, either in the cytosol or in the nucleus. Then what that's going to do, remember, is that's going to trigger transcription and translation. So what we're going to do is we're going to make RNA, and then from that RNA, the cell is going to make new protein. Okay, so that's review. Linking what we're talking about now to what we've talked about before. So let's see, how are we doing on time? All right, pathology. A pathology associated with the thyroid gland. The one that I think might be most familiar or somewhat familiar is Graves' disease. Graves' disease, what happens is that a person gets an infection. Oh, I was going to use this image right here, Graves' disease. Somewhere along the line in a person's life, they get an infection and their body produces antibodies. And what happens is that the antibody that their body produces also happens to match the lock of receptors on the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland here, that antibody weirdly comes and it can bind those receptors on the thyroid gland. And this happens a lot with autoimmune diseases, is that the body produces an antibody, the antibody fights off the infection, but then that key happens to fit a lock in the body. So an antibody comes and it overstimulates the thyroid gland. Hyperstimulates the thyroid. So what's going to happen then as a result of this hyperstimulation of the thyroid? Think about this at multiple levels. This is the type of question that you would get on an assessment, and I would want a lot of detail here. So hyperstimulus of the thyroid. Thyroid is getting super, super stimulated. A couple of things are going to happen. When a gland gets hyperstimulated, it's going to get bigger. So one of the things, I'm going to go down here now. One of the things that's going to happen is that the thyroid is going to go from its just kind of normal size, and it's going to hypertrophy. It's going to hypertrophy because it's being constantly stimulated. It's going to get big. And so what this can look like is like a swelling in the neck that's called a goiter. Then we're going to have broad systemic effects. Think about all the things that T3 and T4 stimulate. Muscle contractions, bone health, brain development, digestion, heart function. So the thyroid is then way overproducing T3 and T4. And so you get these massive systemic effects. People have things like resting tremor, meaning that their hands, their body shakes. We got all sorts of stuff. I'm just going to tell you a few. We get resting tremor. So that would be effects on the muscles. You get irritability. You've got, as I said, an enlarged thyroid. The skin is warm and moist. Okay, remember T3, T4 up our metabolism. People lose their hair. People will just sort of stare, and their eyelids don't close and open very fast. They're heat intolerant. So these are just a couple, like massive, huge, total body, all over, everywhere effects. And so then what we're going to think about next is you have a patient that comes in. We're going to imagine a scenario. You have a patient that comes in and they have a great big thyroid. So your patient, they have an enlarged thyroid. Okay. They have tremor. They have irregular periods. And insomnia. How could you figure out if what's going on with this person is actually Graves' disease? We've got an enlarged thyroid. Is Graves' disease necessarily the only thing that can cause that? So the way that we can do this is we can look back at our hormone cascade that we talked about earlier. So we go back, I think I have that drawn up here somewhere. Nope, I didn't draw it out. Okay. Oh yeah, here I did. All right. We go back to our hormone cascade, and I'm going to draw this differently. I'm going to draw this how you're probably going to see it in class. So we have our hypothalamus. And then our hypothalamus that should be the anterior pituitary. Our hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary. Our hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary with thyrotropin releasing hormone. Then our anterior pituitary stimulates the thyroid with thyroid releasing hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, and then the thyroid releases T3 and T4, which have systemic effects and an overall increase in metabolism. So what we're going to think about then is, as we look at this entire cascade, what do we expect to see? What expected levels do we expect to see in this cascade? And one of the most important components of this is to think about what's feeding back where. So this increase in T3, T4, this is going to feed back, negative feedback going back to those earlier concepts. It's going to feed back to the hypothalamus when we get high levels of T3, T4 in the blood, and it's going to tell the hypothalamus, okay, stop producing TRH. It's also going to feed back to the anterior pituitary and tell the anterior pituitary, stop producing thyroid stimulating hormone. So in the natural system, we're going to get long loop negative feedback from the release of T3 and T4. So if this person has Graves' disease, what are we going to expect to see at each of these levels? What are we going to expect to see if we want to test? We're going to say, I'm going to put this in pink too, because these are our hormones. We're going to test hormone levels. So the question is, what hormone levels do we expect to see of T3, T4, thyroid stimulating hormone, and TRH if this person has Graves' disease? So stop and think about that for a second. What do you expect to see? What levels do you expect to see of each of these hormones? Okay. If your patient has Graves' disease, then we're going to expect to see very, very, very high levels of T3 and T4, because this antibody is stimulating the thyroid. The thyroid produces T3 and T4. So we're going to have high T3 and T4. What about the other hormones in the cascade? Think about that for a second. We're going to expect to actually see very low levels of, I'm going to do a different color here, thyroid stimulating hormone, lower than normal levels of thyroid stimulating hormone, and lower than normal levels of thyrotropin releasing hormone. So what this tells you, it allows you to isolate the level of the pathology, because we're getting lots of T3 and T4. But T3 and T4, the release of T3 and T4 isn't being signaled by the normal pathway, because we have really low TRH and really low thyroid stimulating hormone. So what that tells you is that the feedback, the negative feedback, is working. This T3, T4 negative feedback to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary is working, because we're getting low TRH and low thyroid stimulating hormone. That tells you that there's something happening at the level of the thyroid that's stimulating the release of T3 and T4. And so you've been able to narrow this down to, yes, there's definitely something happening at the level of the thyroid. This could very well be Graves' disease. So this is an example of a kind of thought question that you'll expect to see on the assessment.